Today on the MMA Beat, we're talking Aldo versus Pettis, Couture versus Dana, The Ultimate Fighter versus Fightmaster, and so much more. And guess what? It all starts right now. Hello again, everyone. Welcome inside our New York City studios. I'm Ariel Helwani, and this is a brand new episode of the MMA Beat right here on MMAfighting.com. We've got a ton to get to this week. Let us waste no time. We'll introduce the panel, and then we'll get down to the nitty-gritty. We welcome back Jack Encarnacion. He is the host of the SureDog.com radio network. He's also the host of NBC Sports Boston's Mouthpiece MMA show. Welcome back, my friend.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
Good to have you back. We've also got the Connecticut boys in the house, Mike Chiappetta of MMAfighting.com, and Chuck, don't call me Mindenhall of ESPN.com. ESPN, the magazine, Fight Magazine, anything else?
That about covers it, I think.
All right. Welcome back, guys. Good to have you here. A lot to get to, guys, as I said on the top. Let's start with what I think was the big news story of the week. Jose Aldo versus Anthony Pettis. This kind of came out of nowhere. Anthony Pettis texted Dana White Saturday night after the title fight at UFC 156. He said he wanted to go down. The UFC obliged. They gave him the fight, but in August. We'll start with you, Jack. Did the UFC make the right call?
I think so. I think this is going to be 2013. You know, guys who drop weight classes or change weight classes for immediate title shots. And they think it's going to work. They're oriented in that way and not afraid of doing that. And yeah, I think it's a very exciting stylistic fight. It's really, you know, it has all the elements of what we get excited about in a mixed martial arts fight. You know, title implications, a lot of people are sort of left lingering and left in limbo when you do something like this. But ultimately, I think it's a good move because Pettis and Aldo both could always use a boost to their profile. So you bring that dynamic together, and it makes the fight bigger than if they were just fighting on their own.
Pettis said, Mike, that the reason why he wanted this fight was because he didn't want to wait anymore. He had a couple of title shots taken away. He was tired of waiting. But the fight's happening in August. The winner of Benson versus Gilbert probably would have been ready in August. Doesn't that kind of make you a little confused?
I guess the key word there is probably be ready.
Right.
I'm an old guy, so I'm going to use the old expression, a bird in the hand's worth two in the bush, right? Most people probably have no idea what that means.
I have no idea what you just said.
But
Please explain.
Basically, I mean, this is a guarantee now. He's fighting Jose Aldo unless one of them gets hurt. But with the Henderson-Mullins fight, you have to hope that everything breaks correctly and that the winner of that fight doesn't come out injured. It's with lighter weight fights, they tend to go longer distance, 5 rounds, much more opportunity to come out with an injury and need more time. He got what he wants. He wants a title fight. He wants a big fight. He got that. To me, in looking at this situation, I kind of felt like after Jose Aldo beat Frankie Edgar, I kind of felt like, you know, what does he have left to prove at 145? He just beat a former, pretty well-regarded lightweight champion. Maybe it's time for him to move up. I kind of thought that might be what they looked at. And so to me, it's kind of interesting that they brought down basically a guy who was going to challenge for the 155 belt anyway. And so now he's fighting, you know, 2 back-to-back 155-pound, you know, top 3 guys, arguably. After this, I really don't know what's left for Jose Aldo at 145.
I thought it rang out like an epiphany, really, when Dana White was in that press conference and he mentioned that Anthony Pettis was the guy. You could tell by him sharing that text that he liked the idea. I don't think he would have shared who was texting him unless he really liked the idea. And in my mind, you know, that fight makes a lot of sense to me, except for when they mentioned that it was going to be in August. That was the only little bit of illogic that happened there with the whole thing. But he does have a target now, and to me, that's a great fight. We talk the guys obviously being left out, Ricardo Lamas and the Korean Zombie. Korean Zombie has been out for a long time, and he was never guaranteed that next shot anyway. And Ricardo Lamas, we really didn't hear his name too much. I think he was sort of promoting himself to be the guy, and he has the resume. He's beat the guys. I don't think he has a big enough marketable name to just automatically be that guy. Maybe you have those two square off for a number 1 contenders bout now, and hopefully it shakes out better for everybody.
I think that's the biggest strike against Lamas, which really isn't his fault. It's that he's not a big name. You know, he's a guy that's come on well in the last year, since he's moved to this division.
Sure.
He's done extremely well. You know, he's beaten 3 top 10 guys, got a great resume there, but still is not to the level where he's well known and could be a pay-per-view draw. Anthony Pettis, you know, he's been around a while. He's got a lot of really highlight reel type finishes and even just moves in the middle of fights. He's an easy guy to promote. He's flashy. He's young, good-looking guy. I'm sure he's got Yeah, he's well-spoken.
Dynamic strikers too. Both
charismatic.
those guys. I mean, you
Yeah,
think about
dynamic.
just the way they'll come at each other is just pretty amazing to contemplate. So
What we're seeing here is a point where the UFC went through an iteration, a couple of years, where they tried to match the champion with a top contender, the consensus top contender, put that on pay-per-view as a main event, and went with it. They didn't have tremendous success on pay-per-view in the past year or so. And now they've totally changed their mindset to where Sonnen fights Jones, Cormier might fight Jones, Vitor Belfort is plugged into title fights, as he was in the Jones situation, which I understand was, mitigating circumstances there. But this is just another example of that, where they're not going with a pay-per-view headline mentality of champion versus number one contender. That just doesn't sell as well as an exciting potential clash of guys whose styles have just jumped through the screen in recent performances. And so the fans' mind starts turning like, what if these two guys actually fought each other? You watch the Edgar fight with Aldo, and you can't help but think, what if somebody could challenge him in exchanging leg kicks with sharp jabs and add in the kind of acrobatics Pettis has, plus the mentality of the UFC apparently coming into 13 as far as how they're matchmaking. It was a really savvy move by Pettis. He read the tea leaves really well because they're in that frame of mind now. I don't think you could say the same thing last year or the year before.
Guys, I gotta say, I'm actually kind of blown away by your responses. I do agree with Chuck. It's a fun fight. Stylistically, I like it. Two great strikers, yes, that makes sense. But other than that, I really don't think that this fight makes any sense for a few reasons. First off, Pettis said the reason why he wanted this fight to begin with was because he didn't want to wait for the winner of Benson versus Gill. That fight's happening in April. I mean, the winner of that fight probably would have been ready to fight in August. Yes, someone on Twitter told me that it's the 110th anniversary of Harley-Davidson, which is based in Milwaukee. Showtime's from Milwaukee. The UFC hasn't given us a reason why the fight is taking place in August, but that's in like 6 months. That's in a long time he's gonna have to wait. Also, I mean, in my opinion, the most sellable, or one of the most sellable fights that the UFC has in 2013 is Pettis versus Bendo 2. If Benson wins in April, you show that Showtime kick over and over again. Pettis beat him, so he has that under his belt. I just don't understand why you don't wait to see what happens on Fox. And then above all that, I'm afraid that the sport is becoming too much like boxing. And I'm not here to knock boxing. I like boxing, but in boxing, it can get confusing with guys going up and down, weight classes, all that stuff. It's hard to keep up with it. And now we're seeing, we're talking about Evans coming down, 185. We're talking about Cormier going down to 205. Edgar coming down, Pettis coming down. I want to see guys get rewarded for the work that they're doing in their divisions, and right now that's not happening in the UFC.
Well, look at it less from the perspective of how sellable Pettis versus Henderson 2 would be, and what makes Anthony Pettis more sellable. A guy who can beat Ben Henderson and then go down to 145 and beat Jose Aldo, and then still have a totally valid claim to go up and fight Ben Henderson anyway. You can have both in MMA, and I think people forget that. It's risky, but I can see why you tried to do that. Short of BJ Penn and Uriah Faber, south of 155, really haven't been enough big stars that have been able to really move the needle over the course of the UFC's history. And you have to do big things like switch up a weight class and fight one of the best pound-for-pound ranked guys in the world and beat him to really put your stamp on things. I think that's a big part of the reason why the Edgar-Aldo fight came together in the first place. These are two guys who, in a vacuum, kind of struggled to really break through and do big numbers, but when put together, something extra happens. And for Pettis, it's a great opportunity.
Yes, but no one has brought this up. What if Pettis wins? Pettis wins. He's the 145
then Pettis made an awesome move.
Yeah, but he sticks around at 145, a weight class he doesn't want to be at.
Not necessarily. He could go right back to 155.
They're not going to let him go up and down.
I bet they would.
Hold that title at 145 and go up to 155?
Yep, I bet that's the idea.
Pettis versus like Korean Zombie wouldn't be a draw?
No, but then you can't get the fights at 155 that we were looking forward to, and he can't hold the belt and go up to 155 and put that division on ice with this many shows.
He might not put it on ice. He might vacate it, or he might.
If you assume he could be a star as the 155 champ, he certainly could be a star at the 145.
But there were fights we wanted to see him fight at 155. Now we're opening.
Well, there was really one fight. There was really one fight, the Bendo rematch.
Gilbert, you don't want to see him fight Gilbert? You want to see him fight Gray Maynard, who's been calling him out?
Well, you don't want to see him fight the Korean Zombie?
Well, I wanted to see the Korean Zombie fight Aldo.
For Pettis, none of these have the impact.
Don't say that.
For Pettis, none of these have the impact of being the guy to beat Jose Aldo.
I just have a hard time. Yes, it's a fun fight, but to me, a bigger impact for him would have been getting the rematch against Benson after he won on Fox twice. It's a bigger deal in his career. Plus, he probably would have had that fight in August if Benson would have won and wouldn't have had an injury or so.
I think Jack hit on something before when he was talking about Pettis being a star. This is a star-driven sport, especially when you're talking about pay-per-views, selling pay-per-views, which is what Zuffa's business is. Anthony Pettis is much more of a star than Ricardo Lamas is at this stage. And to me, that's the biggest reason he's getting promoted into this spot over Lamas. Now, I know we're going to talk about rankings at some point today.
Right.
I think part of the reason Zuffa is doing rankings for UFC fighters is because it's going to help people understand, people who maybe don't watch, can't watch every show, because there is a lot of product out there. They can't watch every show. It'll be easier for them to have an understanding of where these guys rank. Now, if you can't watch every show, you probably don't, you haven't seen all of Ricardo Lamas's wins. You haven't seen him beat 3 top 10 guys in a row. If you go to the rankings and you see that he's ranked number 1 or number 2 in the division, I think it becomes a little easier for people to understand, or maybe to even look to that person to, generate more interest in them. Just to, you know what I'm saying?
I think you just proved my point, Mike. If a casual fan is looking at these rankings and sees Korean Zombie,
rankings just started.
Okay, but if he's looking at the rankings and seeing Korean Zombie, Anthony Pettis can't be ranked until he actually fights at 145. So they're gonna wonder, why is this guy getting a title shot? He's in another weight class.
That's
what
a
about
risk, that's
2
the
and
risk of
3?
these rankings, but all indications are the UFC really plans on ignoring them when it comes to matchmaking. The rankings happen because Fox is accustomed to their sports coming off a certain way on television and giving their viewers certain information. They do it with college football. They have the power rankings that they have their reporters kind of put together, and the people that work on that side of things. So it's really an accommodation for production element for Fox, and it certainly will not dictate how the UFC makes its fights. In fact, this is the absolute opposite year, considering the fights that have been made, for that to, Zuffa, Dana, Lorenzo, Joe Silva, all the way down, have never thought rankings and broadcasting them and making a big deal about them makes sense, because they know that you have to be flexible to make the fights that make the money on pay-per-view to keep the gears turning.
It's funny that on the week that they roll out these rankings, these consolidated rankings, they trump it by doing something completely illogical, like booking the same day. So it's like, its relevance went out the window on the very day that they unveiled it.
So what do you think of the rankings, Chuck? I mean, you're a guy who's been covering the sport a long time. You're a veteran journalist, right? I mean, for someone who works for someone like ESPN, an outlet like ESPN, it has been brought up that this is a potential conflict of interest, that media shouldn't do this, that it could lead to other issues as far as our dealings with fighters, managers, the UFC. What do you think? Is this much ado about nothing? What's your take?
As long as it's clear that it's the UFC rankings, we're ranking the UFC fighters. We're not ranking all of MMA, because obviously you're not going to have the Michael Chandlers, you're not going to have those guys making their way into these rankings. So as long as it's clear that this is within one promotion, I don't really see, I don't really get all the talk about it being controversial or a conflict of interest or any of that stuff. But I do look at it as sort of a gauge to show how ignorant we all are, because honestly, what did we see out of this was just a lot of nitpicking about this guy and this guy and this guy. So all your biases can play out in public for everybody to see. And for the most part, though, I think it gives us a premise of what everybody thinks, and just in terms of where these guys are. And I think just kind of glancing at them, I didn't get a chance to really study whoever everybody had. It seemed like a lot of the guys that we all think, or that we would think should be up there, were up there. So in some ways, it's just a premise to look at, I think.
There's always nitpicking. Mike, Jack brings up the Fox issue, and I think that's a major part of it. When the UFC returns to Fox in April, they could throw out the rankings and say, hey, Gilbert's number 2, he's fighting number 1, et cetera, et cetera. So I think for TV purposes, that's really why they're doing it, or for the casual fan. But there are some who have brought up the fact that, this is Zuffa's way of controlling the narrative. This is their way of making us forget about the Chandlers and the Kerns of the world. And let's be honest, I mean, if we did do an MMA rankings, 5% would be non-Zuffa fighters at this point. They've really controlled the marketplace. Guys are coming up in Bellator and other organizations, but right now, do you think there's anything to that?
Well, if it was their way of controlling the narrative, has it really worked? As we're saying, Anthony Pettis is going to be fighting for the featherweight title. He's not ranked at featherweight. Chael Sonnen is fighting John Jones for the light heavyweight championship in April. The rankings came out. He's not ranked at light heavyweight. So when they're selling that fight, they're selling an unranked fighter fighting for the belt.
In particular,
so how does that help? He
probably appears even on the 185 rankings fairly low at this point after losing.
I don't think he's ranked at all.
I don't even know if he's in the 185 rankings. It's very weird.
It's even crazier for that situation.
Here's a fundamental truth about rankings, and I know this having been with Sherdog for so long, and we do rankings that a lot of people turn to as definitive. Everyone says rankings don't mean anything, and that is total nonsense. Rankings make such a difference behind the scenes when a manager sits down with a promoter and tries to negotiate.
Yep.
It gets fighters on the radar. Always has, always will. And if rankings don't matter, nobody cares about rankings, then why does this discussion always provokes so much temper tantrums and excitement, and you know, if it doesn't matter, no one would care to discuss it. People are obsessed with deciding who's better than the next guy, and rankings play into that and introduce some kind of objective way to go about it.
In fact, I could see the only ones really sort of suffering now that these rankings are out, Joe Silva, Sean Shelby, UFC matchmakers, because when they sit down with those managers and say, hey, look, Ricardo Lamas is ranked so-and-so, whatever, he deserves this much money. He deserves to be fighting this guy. That's where, you know, in the past they could say, oh, he's on SureDog, but the UFC could say, well, what does that mean?
Right,
you know?
exactly.
But now it's the UFC rankings, right? And I think that could lead to a lot of problems for them.
Well, one thing they do avoid is having guys who don't fight for them already get into that picture. Someone might look and see, who are the best fighters at middleweight? Let me look. Or let me go to featherweight. Who are the best fighters at featherweight? Well, who's Pat Curran? You know, there's nothing the UFC can do to control those people coming on the radar and being compared in fans' minds as how well they could compete with the UFC's guys. And you're right, it's becoming less and less of an issue as they've controlled more and more of the market share. But still, you're going to get those situations when you're talking about rankings where guys have this sort of objective thing they can point to hanging out there to say, you know, maybe I shouldn't get paid more than everybody, but why don't I get paid as much as that guy?
Yeah,
Final word on this?
Well, you know, I was just thinking, the people that complain that, you know, it is just a UFC-only product, these rankings, I mean, UFC is making it clear that that's what it is. They're not trying to hide that. You look at a sport like college basketball, every year in college basketball, we'll see a Division II team beat a Division I team, or a Division I AA team beat a Division I team. Those teams cannot make the rankings. It's Division I rankings. So it's not really that different than other sports where you can only be ranked in where you know, the group that you belong to. So I don't feel like they're doing anything wrong as far as, you know, ranking their own men.
Yeah.
Last week, also in Las Vegas, you were there, Chuck, and one of the big non-fight storylines was Dana White versus Randy Couture.
Right.
Part, what, 3, 4? I'm not sure
Right,
at this
yeah.
point. Randy has left Zuffa. He's no longer working with Fox. He signed a deal with Spike TV. This week it was announced that he'll be a coach on Fight Master, which we'll talk about in a second, and also another show called Gym Rescue. And I'm just wondering about first your take on how Dana handled this situation, because it seemed like to a degree he was biting his tongue, but he also said a lot about Randy Couture.
Dana gonna Dana.
Yeah, Dana's going to be Dana. I think that Randy Couture was talking to Josh Gross in an article he just wrote, and he said that he responded predictably, and I think that that's really what it comes down to. When we saw that Randy was going to Bellator and that was the news, what was the first thing that went through everybody's mind is, what's Dana going to do? How is he going to respond to this? Or does he already know? And how is he going to, you know, what is he going to tell us about this? I thought he responded very predictably. I did feel like he was a little held back, like you mentioned, but he pretty much responded how we thought he would, which is to kind of air some of the dirty laundry that went back and forth, make him sound like a coward, put those things out there, kind of besmirch his name a little bit. And that's what I would have expected him to do. And I thought that in the end, Couture, you know, he sort of took the high road a little bit more and said he thought it was predictable, and that's what he was expecting.
Do you have any problem with what Couture did? He had one fight left on his Fox deal. I mean, this happens all the time in the world. I mean, you leave deals and you go sign somewhere else. Any problem with what Couture did?
You know, from the story I read with Josh Gross wrote on ESPN, was that Randy had an out on his contract, and he had a chance to get out with 30 days notice or something, and that's the route that they take. Dana seems to have a different opinion on the time frame or whatever. So I don't think we truly know what the truth of the story was. The biggest problem I had with it, I mean, Dana, obviously, you know how he's going to respond. He's an emotional guy, and that's how he treats business. Business is emotional to him. It's his life. The biggest problem I had with it is him basically banning Randy from cornering his son at fights. I mean, I don't even know if he has the power to do that, to be honest with you. I mean, I spoke to Keith Kaiser about that the other day, and he said cornermen are up to fighters. As long as they're licensed by the commission, they're allowed to choose who they want. Dana seemed to believe that he could ban Randy from cornering Ryan. I don't know if he can or can't. It's his, you know, the day of an event, it's kind of his building, so maybe he can. I don't think he should put him in that position. I don't think it's fair. When you train as a fighter, you want to go to war with the guys that were with you the entire camp. Obviously, his father has more MMA knowledge than almost anybody walking this planet. He's obviously a great corner man to have.
He's a fight master.
He's a fight. He is a fight master.
As it were.
You know, if you're going to make adjustments in between rounds, there's probably nobody better to have in your corner than Randy Couture as far as trying to make changes on the fly. And I think that's a big negative for him to not have his father in his corner if that's what he wants. And I don't think it was fair of Dana to put him in that position where he can say, you know, you can stay here in the UFC and fight, and it'll be your home, but you can't have your father there with you.
Yeah, your father.
It's not just your father, but exactly. It's not just your father; it's your corner too. And in this instance, the corner part is actually more important.
We've seen though in situations where Dana's had a sour relationship with guys who've ended up in corners. They just
Shamrock's
right, exactly. So I really don't.
I don't know how much that'll actually play out or matter. Randy Couture beat Maurice Smith for the heavyweight title in 1997, and he left because they couldn't pay what was on the contract. That was prior ownership under SEG. He left as UFC heavyweight champion in 2007 because he, in part, felt like Zuffa wasn't being honest about how much they could afford to pay him relative to how much Mirko was making and some of those other issues. Randy Couture will just bounce if he doesn't feel like he's getting the best deal that he possibly can. He's always been that guy, and fortunately for him, he's so unbelievable in the cage that he can afford to be that guy. And this is just the latest iteration of that. You know, just because he came back to fight Brock Lesnar because he couldn't win in court in the Fedor fight could not happen because, you know, eventually they lost interest in this long court battle that it would take, doesn't mean that they were happy, you know, to work together again, Zuffa and Randy. Once you kind of have that moment, that bumping up of interests, especially as dramatic as Randy Couture's exit was with Dana, that just doesn't go away. And it was just a matter of time. And who knows, maybe Randy feeds the fire a little bit too. He's probably just as strong a personality in these types of things. We see that Randy Couture, you know, doing interviews. I did a very long interview with him last year. So engaging to talk to, so detail-oriented. He's just such a great interview and such a great public persona, which maybe is part of why he's going over to the Bellator reality show. But behind the scenes, he drives a hard bargain, and, you know, that doesn't last too long with Dana's mentality.
He should drive a hard bargain. He deserves to. You know, he's earned everything that he's gotten.
Yep.
You know, business is sometimes you got to get in there and you got to fight and claw for what you believe is yours. And let's face it, we've talked about the union thing for a long time.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no union. These guys have to fight for everything that they get. And Randy's been more out there than some of the other guys.
Randy's always been a guy, I'm sorry, Chuck, Randy's always been a guy who never felt like he was the person the UFC was pushing as the face of the company. He had to upset people to become that guy, from Pedro, all the way back to Pedro Rizzo. You know, we're talking about a long time where he's felt that way. And, you know, that's just kind of coming home to roost. He's always been an underdog, even in the eyes of the caste system that the UFC set up.
What I like is that he's joining this cast of exiles over there with this TV show. I mean, we've got Shamrock and Greg Jackson. It's sort of an interesting situation that's developed.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that. You know, The Ultimate Fighter is enjoying a resurgence on Tuesday nights, although the ratings did go down a little bit this week, interestingly enough. Yeah. Great knockout, ratings go down weird, and it was promoted so well. Fight Master, 4 coaches, you get to pick your coaches, you get to pick who you fight. You've got, you know, Randy, of course, Shamrock, you've got Greg Jackson. Joe Warren seems to have been a spot better reserved for like a Tito Ortiz based on what they're doing, but anyway, you get Joe Warren. By the way, who's going to choose Joe Warren when you've got like, no disrespect, but I mean, it's just, what is he?
It's going to be an awkward episode.
Yeah, and they get to choose their opponents. Seems like a little confusing off the bat. What do you think? Could this be the sort of remedy for all the Ultimate Fighter's problems?
I don't know. When you take a look at what Bellator is going to try to do with that reality show, I mean, there's some autonomy there, which is interesting, I guess. But ultimately, it is it's still going to be a similar take to what they did before. But the good thing I like about them is a lot of times we see their tournament structure. I mean, if you're a casual fan, you probably maybe know one of the guys in the tournament. You may not know any of the other guys. I think it's good to add identity. It's at least a step in the right direction for them to add identity. These guys kind of show them in a different context coming up, because if half of it is manipulating perception and you know, teaching about who these guys are, then that's a perfect platform for them to get guys kind of rolling on that. As far as the new Ultimate Fighter, are we talking about that as well? Or are we?
Sure.
Okay. Well, as far as the new Ultimate Fighter, I mean, I feel like they've made the franchise a little more wild. I didn't watch the last couple seasons, I'll admit, just because it was following a formula that was the same. They've done some things with the production and everything this time, and the narratives on that first show, similar to what I was just talking about, where you kind of knew who these guys were a little bit more. And I've been enjoying it a lot more this year. I don't feel like I'm watching the same old show.
Going back to Fight Master, Mike, is this...
You really like saying Fight Master.
Well, that's the name of the show. Is this an idea that you can get behind? Do you think this will help Bellator the way it helped the UFC?
I don't know. I think it's too hard to kind of make that determination right now. I mean, we haven't seen it. We don't know what it's going to look like physically. We just have kind of a general guideline, basic understanding of what it's going to be. I think to me it's interesting that Bellator loves tournaments so much. They're doing a tournament to get into the tournament. But what I think is good is we've seen that it's not only with Bellator, what they've done in their season this year and what they're going to do with this reality show, but also what Ultimate Fighter is doing. They're really pushing personalities now. You know, in the past, I don't know how many seasons, Ultimate Fighter has really been, you know, a testosterone-fueled rampage of violence, and that's really the only thing they've sold. This year, a lot more focus from the very first episode where they introduced families and things has been put on the person behind, you know, the competitor, the person. And we saw, you know, even this episode on Tuesday with Uriah Hall getting this incredible knockout, which was, you know, arguably one of the best knockouts we've seen in the last couple of years. You know, what I liked is I think it was online, but they showed, you know, the reaction to how Uriah Hall was like, you know, very upset, and he apologized to the guy. He literally said, "I'm sorry." To
it was great TV.
Great. I mean, he came across like really as a heartfelt, like good person, and I think a lot of people like to see that they're just not like animals that are going out there.
Including the Chael Sonnen conversation with him before that
totally.
too.
But I think we're seeing this from Bellator and the UFC as well. I think that's good as far as developing stars. You know, you have to have a connection with them, and it comes partly from that.
The little bit we know about Fight Master is that it's going to be a lot less focused on the tension of these people training together. In fact, there's not going to be a mansion or a house they all live in, apparently. But it's going to be deep dives into every single participant's backstory and what they're doing here. Kind of longer form versions of the pre-fight vignettes Bellator already does, where they pick an aspect of a guy's personal life and tell you a lot more about it. It could work. You have to do anything that you can to make people stand out, to make fighters on your roster stand out. Bellator has a big problem with that. They have a lot of guys who are just names in a crowd, and they get competitive fighters that are available for the budget they can afford, but they don't have really a mechanism to make guys stand out as someone you invest in personally, not just because of how good of a fighter they may or may not be.
Final word on this, do you have any problem with Greg Jackson being on the show?
No, I think it's kind of ingenious because Dana can't badmouth Greg Jackson in terms of bringing back John Jones. Remember that agreement?
Right.
So I can see why Greg would do it too. Greg kind of fits the Randy category, right? A guy who is so gregarious and awesome to talk to and is so such an open personality in MMA space. But, you know, behind the scenes, Dana makes cracks about how, you know, he's really, really, really savvy. And this is a very savvy move from Greg Jackson.
Jackson, I like it.
Gregarious Greg.
Mike, we'll end on this topic, and it's one that we could probably do a whole show on. But you
I don't want to end yet. Keep going.
You mentioned the T word, testosterone. And
I got an exemption for this show.
That's good to know. Another guy who got an exemption was Vitor Belfort. Came out that at UFC on FX7 when he knocked out Michael Bisping, he was using TRT, got a TUE, therapeutic use exemption from the commission over there in Brazil. Now, again, a lot of people have been accusing Vitor of stuff, but at the bottom line is this is a guy who was once accused and tested positive for PEDs. Do you have any problem with Vitor Belfort, given his history, getting a TUE?
I think this has officially reached a point where we can say it's an absolute and total mess, the whole TUE situation, TRT situation. It's really out of control at this point. I did a story last year for MMA Fighting where, you know, I talked about some of the underlying reasons for this condition that could be under the radar, and one of them was brain injury, brain trauma. It is possible that fighters who have this, who fight for 20 years, they gain pituitary damage that leads to this problem happening. But it just seems that this is happening at such a rate where I don't know how many guys we've gotten in just the last year, 5 or 6 guys, and all big name guys, by the way, that you just kind of have to believe that where there's smoke, there's fire. I mean, I spoke to an NFL person at that time, and he said in the 20-plus year history of them having a TUE program, they had only given out about a half dozen exemptions for testosterone replacement therapy. And this is for going back to 1990. And a lot of people were like, other leagues don't allow it. They do. But they have a much more rigid system in place. I think the one thing we see, when they go through in front of commissions and have hearings, most of the time the doctors that the commission uses, they're not specialists in the areas where they need to be to completely understand whether these guys really need it or not. You need to have like an independent panel of endocrinologists, people that understand the pituitary system and understand whether these guys truly actually need it or not, and whether it was something caused by steroid usage or something that's where they actually need it, where it was a problem that they've had for years or whatever the case may be. There's just not enough knowledge at play here on behalf of the commissions, and until then, it's going to stay a total mess, and it's bad for the sport.
Are they doing enough? Is the UFC, the commissions, are they doing enough to find out if guys really actually need this stuff?
No, not at all. We need blood testing just as often as urine testing. We need to know at all times if someone's granted a TUE what the concentration in their serum blood is. Normal range, 300 to 1,200. It's a wide range, nanograms per deciliter. Got to stay within that range, got to prove it consistently, and it has to be publicly disclosed. That is what's key to all this, because it's the behind-the-scenes smoke and mirrors that make this totally illegitimate, even if you're a guy like Dan Henderson who can lay all the paperwork on the table and say, this is why I need it, and it's hard to argue with him. In terms of bringing your testosterone, which is low for who knows what kind of reasons. Honestly, let's say anabolic steroid usage shuts down the endocrine system and creates this fake testosterone production process in your body that, shows in different ways than just putting testosterone directly into your system without, the banned anabolic agents. This is all loophole kind of stuff and very, very technical and complicated. But until we know how much the total concentration level is in every fighter's blood going into a fight, specifically at least ones who have gotten TUEs, we can't talk honestly as if we know whether these guys are coming into that cage or in camp with a huge advantage in recovery time, a huge advantage in terms of being able to put on strength faster with less work. There's so much more has to be done. Blood work, just like in the Olympics, blood work is just as routine as urine testing. We can have a serious discussion about whether this is being fairly and reasonably monitored.
Chuck, if you're Michael Bisping, are you pissed?
I'd be a little mad, yeah, because, I think that Michael Bisping, of all people's, sort of suspected this the whole time anyway. Right. But, there's a point for guys, especially like Michael Bisping, guys who are, in their 30s and, moving on in the game, that you have to look at the word exemption and exempt, and you say, which side do I want to follow? Like, the exemption almost starts to fall on the guy the other way. Am I being an idiot not to do this? And I think that's another part of the problem. We have guys who are casually looking at it. Rich Franklin was just sort of casually glancing over seeing what it might be about.
And people still remember that. Yeah. People still bring him up, and he said, "I don't do it."
He doesn't do it, but just the fact that it was so casual to maybe I will do that, and I think that's where we're at. So they absolutely need to do something more.
Well, Nate Marquardt absolutely needed it. And then he didn't need it anymore.
Right. Exactly.
Shane Roller told me the same thing last year on the program, on the Rewind on Sherdog. He said, I stopped using it. It didn't really make the difference I thought it did, and he kept going.
And I think the cases like Marquardt and Belfort, guys who we know they have a documented history where they were caught using steroids in the past. I mean, shouldn't those guys be more openly scrutinized? Shouldn't they be subject to more random testing? So someone could drop into their gym and test them to make sure that they're not going, they're not pushing the boundaries past the acceptable limits. For them, because most of the time now they're just being tested when they show up to the arena for the fight week, and that's it.
And guys who don't have exemptions don't get the blood tests. Like the only way, that's the thing about this TUE stuff that people don't realize is like, if you come to the commission and tell them and ask for permission to use testosterone, you then subject yourself to more scrutiny and more regular blood tests. I don't see the reason, considering the system in place, why you would just not tell anybody and do it.
I do remember Keith Kaiser telling me that, that he's had guys come up and generally ask about getting an exemption for TRT, and then when they realize, all the paperwork and things they have to go through, they're like, no, never mind.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, what does that tell you?
After Rampage got it for UFC 144, Kaiser said he was getting a lot of calls along those lines. I did a piece about an Olympic judo player named George Hartman. He was in the Olympic track. And he applied for TUE for testosterone in 2006. USADA looked it all over, the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency, and denied it because it turned out the doctor that said he had low testosterone due to hypogonadism was his judo coach, and could not back up really the reasons and the underpinnings of why that testosterone was low. This is a very complicated area we're getting into, and I don't see how it's not just easier to just not accept it. I suppose you're exposing yourself to maybe lawsuits if you don't allow guys who claim that this is along the lines of a disability.
I think you have to. There has to be some level of it because every other sport allows. Even the Olympics allows exemptions for specific.
There's a process.
There's a process. It's a long and detailed process, and they have experts at the tail end of it to make sure that it is a legitimate usage, and that's the part that's missing in our sport. We do not have the legitimate endocrinology experts looking over these applications for exemptions and determining whether this really is a necessary treatment, because there are obviously many ways to game the system. There are probably guys that are using it for a legitimate usage, and there are many others who
That's
are
easy
not.
for you guys to say, well, there's natural 4-to-1 ratios.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, right. I'm 6
I gotta
to 1.
cut you off there, guys. We're out of time. Great stuff. Really appreciate the time. And now we want to hear from you. Let us know in the comments section below, what do you think about anything we talked about today? Aldo, Pettis, rankings, Couture, TRT, a lot of complex stuff. We want to hear from you, and we appreciate you watching and you chiming in every time that you do. For Jack, Mike, Chuck, I'm Ariel. Thank you so much for watching another episode of the MMA Beat right here on MMAfighting.com.